As we work our way through Chapter 1 and kind of our introductory material, one of the major topics I want to mention is classification and diversity. There are literally millions and millions of different types of living things on our planet, and one of the major areas in biology certainly is looking at that diversity, trying to sort out that diversity, figure out how our organisms are related to each other, what do they have in common, and obviously what are some of their major differences. One of the major goals then within the biological sciences is to classify the living species. Because there are so many, how can we sort them out and try to understand those species? And so we try to separate or classify these organisms based on their relationship. How much do they have in common genetically? How closely are they tied to each other? The major goal being, can we put all the close relatives in the same groups? So that I don't have to know something about every single species on our planet, but instead, if I know a little bit about each group, that tells me about the species that are contained in the group. And today we use what's called a hierarchical system. There are 5 million species at a minimum. Some estimates go as high as 10 to 15 million species. We're certainly discovering more and more every day, especially species that live in really extreme environments like deep in the ocean, for example, or under the Earth's surface in the soil. And so we use this hierarchical system, to help sort out all these different species. And so I want to go over our method of classification, and in particular, this system that we use. The branch or the field in biology that sorts out and tries to classify these species is the field of systematics. And a systematist, or someone who works in the field of systematics, is constantly trying to figure out, first of all, how are species related to each other. If we're going to group organisms by their relationship, we have to know, well, who are close relatives and who are distant relatives. And so a large part of the field of systematics is to develop what are called evolutionary trees, which is kind of equivalent to a family tree. If you think about your family and your close relatives, we can group you based on your maybe siblings or your cousins or your parents or your aunts and uncles, or maybe we could look at your extended family in terms of maybe some second or third cousin, maybe somewhere that you've never even met. And so we do a similar thing with species. We can arrange them based on their relationship into these evolutionary trees. Now, to determine relationship and figure out how are species related to each other, there's a number of different factors. Certainly physical traits. What do organisms have in common in terms of their structure of their bones, or perhaps the formation of their wood if we're dealing with a plant? Behavioral traits are sometimes used, although behaviors can be a little bit more flexible. They're not quite as easy to read or to measure as physical traits. Those can be used. And certainly today our major characteristic is DNA. And just like we can do sort of a who's the daddy paternity test to figure out how people are related to each other, we can do these genetic tests on different species to find out how closely related they are, who are related, which species are close relatives, and which species are more distant relatives. And so once a systematist has figured out how species are related to each other, they're going to use this hierarchy to classify organisms. And the hierarchy just means we have several different categories that we put species in, and the categories start out big and broad and general, and then they're going to get very specific. And so, for example, we'll take all the species that live on Earth and put them into only 3 categories, and those 3 categories are called domains. And so each of these domains are very broad. Each contains millions of species, and so they contain relatives, but pretty distant relatives. These domains then are further broken down into kingdoms. Kingdoms are going to be smaller, for example, the animal kingdom, and contain more closely related organisms than the domain did. Each kingdom then is going to be broken down into a smaller group, a phylum, which contains fewer species and closer relatives, and this continues on down the hierarchy. Phyla are divided into different classes. Each class is divided into an order. Orders are divided into a family. Each family is divided into several genera, or each genus, and then each genus is split up into individual species. And there's a lot of argument, certainly in biology today, what exactly is a species, but our concept is pretty straightforward. A species is one type of living organism. And so by the time we get to that lowest category, the species category, we're dealing with just one organism. Now I know that's a lot of vocabulary, a lot of terms throwing at you all those different categories. So let's take a look at a specific example of how our classification hierarchy works. And so here's our categories again, domain being the biggest, and then through the different list here, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then finally species. And let's look at how we as humans kind of fit into this category, in this hierarchy. And so we are in the domain eukarya. And eukarya are organisms that have a nucleus inside their cell. And so this is a broad group. Again, it contains millions of different species. We're in this group, but so are things like amoeba, for example. The eukarya then is broken down into several kingdoms. We are in the animal kingdom. Animals are members of the eukarya that contain a cell that lacks a cell wall, and also that are multi-celled organisms. Now, we're getting fewer species in the animal kingdom. We're getting closer relatives, but it's still a pretty big group. We're in there with other vertebrates, but we're also in there with things like tapeworms and insects. So still some pretty distant relatives, not a lot in common. So the animal kingdom then is going to be further broken down into phyla, and we're in the phylum Chordata. The chordates are animals that have a spinal cord and a central nervous system. So we're getting more and more specific here. Within the chordates, we break them down into classes. We're in the class of mammals, Mammalia. So we're chordates that have milk-producing mammary glands, protein-based hair, 3 bones in our ear, several different characteristics that make us mammals. So now we're getting to relatively close relatives here. We're getting to fewer and fewer species and more in common. The class Mammalia is broken down into different orders. We're in the primate order, so we're mammals that have an opposable thumb, forward-facing, well-developed eyes, very good depth perception is some of our characteristics. We're in the family Hominidae, which includes all the humans and human ancestors, so we're getting very specific. The genus Homo for man, and then Homo sapiens, our species, for modern man. And so we can see we go from very general to very specific. And if we were to compare that to another species, for example, something like the chimp. Chimps are in the same domain, Eukarya. They're in the same animal kingdom. They're in the same phyla, Chordata, and they're within the same class of mammals and within the primate order. And so even if we didn't know anything about humans or chimps, if we see that 2 species have many other categories shared, that tells us that we're very close relatives with that organism. Within the family then, that's where we start to see our split. The chimps are in the family Pongidae, and then Pan troglodyte is a species of the common chimp. And I want to take a moment to go through some of this diversity, some of these larger categories, and just look at some examples of some species that we might find. And if we look at the 3 domains in particular, the first domain that I want to mention is the domain Archaea. And my guess is if I told everyone close your eyes and picture an Archaea in your head, most of us would come up blank. And that's kind of surprising since this is one of the 3 really large groups of organisms that we have. Well, one of the reasons that the Archaea come up blank, we don't really see them, is because we don't come across them in everyday life in any way, shape, or form, really. The Archaea are all single-celled organisms. And single-celled organisms are organisms that live in alone, but they can also live in groups. And I know that sounds kind of contradictory, but single-celled organisms may live in a big pile, or sometimes they attach to each other and live in a long string. But we call them single-celled organisms because all the organisms, let's say, that grow in this long string of cells, they all look exactly alike. They're all exactly the same. And if we remove some of them, we really don't hurt the others. Versus yourself, you're a multi-celled organism. You're not made up of just a trillion cells. You're made up of hundreds of different types of cells. And if I were to go in and remove all of your muscle cells, that would certainly adversely affect the cells that we left behind. And so single-celled organisms like Archaea often are found by themselves, but they also may be found in groups. In particular, the Archaea are made up of a cell type called a prokaryotic cell. And there are 2 major cell types out there in living organisms. Prokaryotic cells are very small. They do not have a nucleus. Now, they do have DNA, but that DNA is usually just kind of mixed in with the rest of the cell. And they're very ancient. Our oldest fossils on our planet are dated at about 3.5 billion, that's billion with a B, years old, and they're all single-celled prokaryotic organisms. And so very small, very primitive types of cells that we find with this domain Archaea. And one of the reasons we don't know much about the Archaea, kind of off the top of our head, is because they tend to live in very extreme environments. We find these things in deep ocean thermal vents or even in hot springs living in boiling hot water. A second domain then are the bacteria, and certainly we're a lot more familiar with the bacteria because they impact us in a daily sort of way, especially if we think of diseases and so on. Now, bacteria superficially look a lot like the Archaea. They have a lot in common. Bacteria are also single-celled organisms. They are also made up of these simple, smaller prokaryotic cells. But when we look at their DNA, we're finding that the bacteria are very genetically distinct from the Archaea, that while they have some common features externally, the way they go about the process of life, their metabolism, is very, very distinct and very, very different from one another. Now, when we think of bacteria, again, we probably think of disease or parasites, and that's true for many bacteria, but realize they're a very diverse group. Now, my guess is if I would have asked you to make a list of 10 living things, no one would have had anything from the Archaea and the bacteria. In fact, Almost everything we think of when we think of life comes into this third category, our domain of eukarya, which is certainly where we fit in within our domains, as we mentioned earlier. Now, the domain eukarya contains some single-celled organisms, but this domain is the only domain of the three that contain true multicellular life, meaning cells living in groups where the cells specialize and organisms are made up of several different types of cells. Our domain gets our name eukarya from our cell type, a eukaryotic cell. And I mentioned before there were two different cell types out there in living things. Prokaryotic, those simple cells with no nucleus. Our other cell type, eukaryotic cells, which are much larger, a little bit more complicated. We have our DNA in its own little compartment called the nucleus, and those eukaryotic cells make up all the members of the domain eukarya. And as I just mentioned, probably when you think of a living organism, almost everything you think of would fit into this domain eukarya. It's a very diverse group containing millions upon millions of species. And because this domain is so diverse, we do break this domain down into different kingdoms. And so here's where our hierarchy from our classification system fits in. And so there are 4 kingdoms that make up the domain eukarya, and I want to take a look at each of these kingdoms and again some of their characteristics, go through and look at this diversity. The first of the kingdoms within the domain eukarya are the protists, the kingdom Protista. The protists most of them are single-celled organisms, and so this is the only kingdom within the eukarya that actually does have single-celled organisms, but we also see some multicellular life as well in the kingdom Protista. Now, I mentioned before that systematists try to group organisms based on their relationship, and in that aspect, this kingdom is a very poor category. It really does not represent relationships at all. In fact, many of the species in the protists are sort of leftovers. They didn't fit nice and neatly in any other category, so they kind of were dumped in here. And so this kingdom really represents a historical kind of dumping ground where lots of organisms were put in here, but it really doesn't reflect or indicate any kind of relationship aspect. And so what we're seeing today in biology is there's a major revision underway within the kingdom Protista where people are trying to study the DNA of these species and see who's related, how closely they're related. And my guess is if you were to come back in 10 years or so and look at a biology textbook, we're going to see this kingdom split up into other kingdoms and kind of cleaned up. But right now, it's still kind of a systematic mess, if you will. Many of these protists are animal-like and have animal characteristics. Some are more plant-like, and others behave more like fungi. Again, a very diverse sort of group. Our next kingdom within the domain eukarya is the kingdom of the fungi. And the fungi are all true multicellular organisms, and so we start to see our cell specialization. We start to see organisms much bigger, and so we're going to be much more familiar with them because we can actually physically see and touch and manipulate them much easier. One of the defining features of fungi is they have a cell wall, so they have a big, thick barrier that protects each of their cells. That in itself is not unique, but what's unique is in the fungi, it's made up of a chemical called chitin. And chitin is a very strong, sugary chemical that, again, is going to serve to protect the cells. Another interesting thing about the fungi is they typically exhibit external digestion, which is just the opposite of how we eat. We have internal digestion as animals. We take our food inside our body, and it's going to be broken down in the stomach and the small intestine to get the nutrients out inside the body. In fungi, they actually excrete their enzymes outside of their body onto their food source. Once it's outside, those enzymes will break their food source down into kind of a slimy nutrient mix, and then the fungi absorb the nutrients back into their body. When we think of fungi, many of them are decomposers living on dead material. Others are more parasitic and live attached to their food source. And so this fits well with that idea of external digestion, where they can excrete those enzymes onto their food. Their food doesn't run away. Instead, it's going to be broken down, and they can absorb those nutrients. And when we think of fungi, certainly we probably think of lots of things like mushrooms and bracts, kind of common fungi. The next kingdom, actually the next two kingdoms, are much more familiar to us. We are certainly part of the animal kingdom, and as animals we are all true multicellular organisms. We lack a cell wall, which is actually unusual. Most organisms do have a big, thick cell wall. We lack this cell wall, which means we lack some of the protection that other organisms have, but the benefit is our cells can change shape more easily, which allows then animals to be much more mobile than other types of organisms. We do exhibit in general internal digestion, which I mentioned earlier, and again, when we think of animals, we think of mobility, different ways to get around, whether it's flying or hopping or swimming or crawling. And so lots and lots of mechanisms for locomotion when we think of animals. Now when we think of animals, we probably think of other vertebrates, things that are kind of cute and cuddly and furry. Here we have lots of marsupials or something like this frog, other vertebrates like the amphibians or even the reptiles. But the reality is if we look at species of animals, most animals are invertebrates, organisms that don't have a spinal cord or backbone, and most of them are marine or living in the oceans, things like these cnidarians or the sea anemones that we see here, things like the mollusks like the squid, and certainly lots and lots of species of different worms, whether it's a roundworm as we see here, or flatworms or segmented worms and so on. And so kind of avoid that pitfall of thinking of animals as just the cute and cuddly furry type and realize that's just a small piece of the pie, that most animals are invertebrates and most are actually marine organisms. Finally then, our last kingdom are the plants. And plants are also all multicellular organisms. Plants do have a cell wall, just like the fungi. However, the plant cell wall is made up of a chemical called cellulose. And so cellulose is kind of a diagnostic feature for plants that we can tell them apart from other organisms. Cellulose is a very interesting chemical. It's very strong and fibrous. If you're taking notes and writing on paper, paper is made up of cellulose. When we make paper, typically we get rid of all the other chemicals in the plant and we just save those cellulose fibers as kind of that strong substance. When we think of plants, we certainly think of photosynthesis, and all plants are photosynthetic. They are taking energy from the sun and using that energy to generate sugars for their food source. But realize, not all organisms that are photosynthetic are plants. There are some photosynthetic protists, and there are certainly some photosynthetic bacteria as well. And so while all plants are photosynthetic, that's not unique to the plant kingdom. And there's about 500,000 or so plant species on our planet today. Some are simple plants like the mosses and the bryophytes. These are some of the oldest plants that we know of in the fossil record. Ferns, and today we think of these types of ferns kind of low growing, but the fossil record indicates that we've had lots of actually trees, fern trees growing in the past. But today, about 95% of all the plant species are flowering plants. And so the vast majority of plants are plants that produce flowers and fruits, something like this orange tree, for example. And as we start looking at this diversity and thinking of our classification, another issue I want to mention, because we'll hit on this throughout the semester, is the idea of species and species names. Now, we can certainly use common names for species when we talk about different organisms, but that becomes a problem when we start looking at scientific study. And so, as an example, I want to look at a plant called Nymphea alba. And Nymphea alba is the scientific name for this plant. And here's a picture of the plant. It's this water lily in the middle. It has these big lily pads. It has this big, beautiful white flower. And around here in Missouri, they've been introduced. They weren't native, but they have been introduced. And they tend to flower around middle to late August on most summers. Now, Nymphea alba is widespread in its native habitat all across Europe. And it goes by over 200 different common names, just depending on which village or which town or which country you might be in. Not only does it go by over 200 different common names, but we have to translate that into lots of different languages depending on which country you happen to be in. And so we can see 200 different common names, all these different languages, but they refer to only one species. And we can see very quickly how complicated this is going to get when we have to sort out and keep track of millions of species. And so because of this, while common names are nice in sort of local places, we really need to have scientific names so that when we speak of Nymphea alba, we know that this is this one particular species of plant, regardless of where we live or what language that we speak. And the field of biology that deals with naming species and describing new species is the field of taxonomy. And so a taxonomist would describe what species look like, where they occur, and come up with unique names for those different species. And this always sounds like a pretty easy job to me, just naming and describing some species, but remember, we have millions of species to describe and sort out. Now, early on, as kind of the science of biology was growing and evolving, one of the first things that biologists did was start to use Latin as a unifying language. And so all species have Latin foundations or Latin derivative as their name to take out that issue of translating species from one language to another. We all use Latin as our biological language. And the founder of taxonomy, or the first person to really describe a taxonomic system, in fact the system that we still use today, was a botanist in Sweden by the name of Linnaeus. And I'm not a big name and date and history kind of person, but Linnaeus is one of those people in the history of biology that made such a significant contribution. You should really be aware of him and his contributions. And so Linnaeus really founded our modern taxonomy system that we use today. So a little bit about Linnaeus. Linnaeus, again, was from Sweden. He was a botanist working with lots of plants, and he was doing most of his work in publishing in about the 1750s, and so a pretty long time ago, certainly. And in the 1750s and later, this was when the New World was really being discovered and studied. All these expeditions to the New World by these Western European countries were bringing back all these hundreds of new species of plants and animals that had never been seen before or described before. And so Linnaeus, as all these new species were coming in, was trying to develop a system to name these organisms. And he developed a system called binomial nomenclature. And binomial translates simply into two names, nomenclature into naming system. And so this is a naming system that's going to use two names whenever we refer to each species. Okay? So as we refer to species, we don't ever call them just a single name. We're going to use two names. And the two names that we're going to use, the first name for a species is always the genus category. And so in our classification system, that small genus category is always going to be the species' first name, and we always capitalize that whenever we write it. The species' last name then would be its species epithet or its species category, and by convention we typically use that as lowercase. So for example, when we refer to humans, we call ourselves Homo sapiens, Homo for our genus and sapiens then for the species. Quercus alba is the white oak tree, a very common tree around here. I mentioned Nymphea alba as that white water lily. Alba, it turns out, is Latin for white, and so a lot of different organisms that have a white characteristics might have alba as part of their species name. But the alba doesn't mean anything by itself. We have to have the genus and species together, Nymphea alba, to describe that particular species. Something like Zea mays or corn, a very common species around here. So in summary for today, one of our major topics was certainly classification, which is done by the field of systematics within biology, who are trying to determine relationship with species and how those species then should be grouped based on that relationship. And we talked a little bit about our hierarchical system, our system of categories that start out very broad and general and get smaller and more specific and contain closer and closer relatives as we go through that hierarchy. Our domains are at the top of the hierarchy. They're our biggest, broadest groups, and we talked about the characteristics of the archaea, the bacteria, and the eukarya. And then we broke the eukarya down into its next category, the kingdoms, and talked about the kingdoms of the protists, the fungi, the animals, and the plants within the eukarya. Our other topic then, we're naming a species. Very briefly, we know that that's done by the field of taxonomy, keeping track of different types of species names and so forth, and that Linnaeus came up with our system of taxonomy back in the 1750s, and that method is called binomial nomenclature, using two names whenever we refer to a single species.